Byzantine Empire, 527 to 1054. Long after the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century, the eastern portion, centered in Constantinople, retained its Roman identity. The Eastern Empire remained prosperous, lying advantageously along both land and sea trade routes. It continued to battle a long-time adversary Persia, and it fought to keep the invaders at bay. The Roman Emperor Constantine had taken for his capital a 1,000-year-old Greek town called Byzantium, renaming it Constantinople. Located on a peninsula between the Black Sea and the Aegean, and possessing a great natural harbor called the Golden Horn, Constantinople could control much of the traffic between Europe and the East. To secure it against enemies, Constantine quickly built walls. To Romanize it, he constructed Christian churches and public buildings and commissioned works of art. Under Justinian, who reigned from 527 to 565, the Byzantine Empire expanded and reclaimed some of the Roman territory lost in preceding centuries. A strong ruler who relied on his beautiful actress wife, Theodora, for advice, Justinian codified Roman law to increase its influence at a time when people were drifting back to a reliance on custom and tradition. Justinian carried on a city rebuilding program begun by Constantine, raising even more Christian churches and decorating them lavishly, including the elaborate Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom, the empire's greatest building. He maintained a shaking peace with Persia and recaptured North Africa, much of Italy, southern Spain, and the islands of the western Mediterranean. Most shortly after Justinian's death, the juggernaut of Muslim armies pushed the frontier back again and steadily pressured the empire from the east. From the north, Bulgars flooded into the Balkan Peninsula and formed a second constant threat. Byzantine forces resisted these incursions in part because of a terrifying new weapon, Greek fire, a combustible sulfurous liquid that could burn even on water. Increasingly isolated from Europe, the former Eastern Roman Empire took on an identity of its own. Reverting partly to its original name, it came to be known as the Byzantine Empire, Greek-speaking, culturally mixed, and for a time the hub of Christian religion. New art and architecture developed from the fusing of many cultures. The city of Constantinople dominated the empire. Rich and crowded, it offered entertainments for all classes. Its large stadium, the Hippodrome, rivaled Rome's Colosseum. Chariot races were particularly popular, and two clubs of racing fans, the Blues and the Greens, became so powerful that they turned into political parties. The empire, strategically located along the major east-west trade routes, soon became the wealthiest and best-governed realm in Christendom. In rural provinces around Constantinople, a loyal peasantry and a workforce, which doubled as an army when needed, produced crops and trade goods, olives, wine, and skillfully worked gold. These were exchanged for ivory, spices, and other luxuries from India and Arabia, grain from Egypt, silks from China, and slaves, furs, and other goods from Russia. Despite occasional border skirmishes with Muslim adversaries, trade was more common than war. The trade network was extensive. Silk found in a Viking grave in Sweden probably originated in Byzantium. Goods flowed in and out of the empire. The riches that accompanied them often stayed. The Byzantine currency, the byzant, was accepted throughout the Mediterranean for some 700 years. But as Constantinople gained prestige, competitive forces arose in Europe. Independent ideas in both politics and religion eventually led to theological differences with the Christians of Western Europe, who followed the lead of Rome. The Frankish king Charlemagne had conquered territory that included modern-day France, the Netherlands, Germany, and most of Italy, forcing the conquered to convert to Christianity. In 800, he was crowned emperor of the so-called Holy Roman Empire by a grateful pope in Rome. The Byzantines ratified the pope's actions since, according to the split that occurred more than 500 years earlier, the Roman world was technically still two sectors, east and west, governed by two different heads. But the cooperation that existed when Diocletian created the two-headed empire no longer existed. Byzantium had become its own empire, and the Franks had carved out a new power. Latin had virtually disappeared as a common language, giving way to Greek in the east and German and Latin Romance language in the west. Many religious differences split the two powers. For example, 8th century Emperor Leo III of the Byzantine Empire opposed the worship of Christian images or icons, and initiated the doctrine of iconoclasm, the banning of their veneration as idolatrous. Many Christians who continued to pay homage to the icons they held as sacred were persecuted. The ban was withdrawn, but bitterness over it fueled the ever-widening rift between what would eventually become two separate Christian churches. The Byzantines made one more successful attempt at expansion. Beginning in 863, under a vigorous Macedonian dynasty, they took back from the Arabs several great Roman cities of the past: Antioch, Alexandria, Caesarea. By 976, the warrior Emperor Basil II had driven the Muslims back to the gates of Jerusalem. In the north, he defeated the Bulgarians, earning the nickname Basil the Bulgar Slayer. He also bested the Georgians, Armenians, and Normans, turned an eye toward retaking Italy, and dreamed of moving into North Africa. Again, as I said before, Justinian had built the Second Roman Empire to rival the First when he conquered lands from Spain to Persia. In latter centuries, Christian Moscow claimed to succeed Constantinople as the Third Rome. The empire, by now far more Byzantine than Roman, had extended its territory in many places, nearly to the borders of Rome's former glory. As the first millennium drew to a close, the Eastern and Western cultures were moving apart in religion as well as in politics. The Byzantine emperor and the Archbishop of Rome contested with each other's religious authority and the relationship between secular and sacred power. Theologians began to dispute such issues as the relationship between God, Christ, and the Holy Spirit. The two churches split officially, called the Great Schism, in 1054, and they are now recognized as the Eastern Orthodox and the Roman Catholic churches. Vikings, 793 to 1042. The economic success of the feudal system in early medieval times meant that considerable wealth had accumulated in Europe, England, and Ireland. As the unity of Charlemagne's empire began to collapse in the late 9th century, this wealth became vulnerable to raids from fierce invaders out of territories that are now Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. These Norsemen were pitiless warriors, but also traders and farmers who sometimes settled in the areas they explored. Centuries of trade and peaceful travel had given them an extensive knowledge of the coast and trade routes of Europe. Natives of a watery world of lakes, streams, and other aquarious kinds, they were excellent mariners and shipbuilders. They ventured fearlessly seaward in trim, graceful craft that withstood heavy swells. As early as the 1st century, the Roman Tacitus, a historian, commented on fleets of Swedish ships having a prow at each end. Those high-carved prows became harbingers of doom around the end of the 8th century when the Scandinavian warriors began moving southward. Technically, the term Viking refers only to raiders, not to the Norsemen as a whole. These raiders, however, may have been prompted to go a Viking by overcrowding at home, where rocky lands offered limited opportunities for farming. Land in the Norse world was typically inherited by the eldest son. Younger siblings might have had needed to leave home to make their fortunes. Whatever the reason, Viking raiders ventured far afield, looting and pillaging towns in Russia, Germany, England, Scotland, Ireland, France, Spain, the Balearic Islands of the Mediterranean, and as far as Constantinople. In France, King Charles the Simple eventually gave them the province that became known as Normandy. The Vikings were drawn to England's deeper soils and to the rich monasteries that had become repositories of Christianity's treasures, as well as its tenets. Unimpressed by the religion, however, they slaughtered churchmen even as they robbed their monasteries. Surprised was the ally of the Vikings, for their numbers were seldom large. With their shallow draft ships equipped with oars as well as sails, they could sweep quickly onto coasts or speed upriver to inland settlements. Fearless in battle, they believed that if killed, they would be borne by warrior maiden Valkyries to Valhalla, the Viking heaven. From the 9th to the 11th centuries, the Vikings sacked Europe's manors, towns, and churches as Christians huddled together and prayed, A furor nominorum libera nos Domini. From the fury of the Northmen deliver us, O Lord. Nothing seemed to hold them back, certainly not fear, for they ventured over open sea to Iceland and Greenland, and probably even made stops in North America. Matter of fact, we know they settled in North America. They found North America, they did not settle there. Sailing around the Spanish coast, they entered the Mediterranean to strike at the continent's underbelly. And east of their homeland, they ruled the first Russian state. The brutal image of the Vikings has overshadowed more positive aspects of their culture. They were skillful in decorative arts, their poetry espoused ideals such as freedom and honor, and they traded as often as they raided, bringing southward goods such as furs and ivory. Trading networks included those connecting the Baltic to the Caspian and the Black Seas along the rivers of European Russia. An Arab chronicler encouraging Norse traders on the Volga River described them as the filthiest of God's creatures, yet tall as date palms, blonde and ruddy. Viking wives knew rights other medieval women could scarcely imagine. They owned land, they ran farms, they kept their maiden names, and could divorce by simply stating it to witnesses. Compared with feudal Europe, with its delineations of class, Viking society was highly egalitarian. "Who is your master?" a Frankish messenger called out to a Viking ship in France. "None," came the reply. "We are all equals." In some ways, Viking raiders strengthened their enemies by forcing disorganized states to cooperate and build defensive forces. As they spread out over wider areas, the Vikings created outposts, thereby losing their mobility and the element of surprise. In this more static position, they were eventually driven out of England by Alfred the Great, and on the continent they were forced to accept the overlordship of French kings. Some adopted Christianity and became absorbed into local populations, as did their language, which enriched English with such words as anger, knife, and slaughter. Charlemagne, 768 to 814. Europe, after the decline of the Roman Empire, was disorganized, occupied by scattered groups of Germanic tribes. Among these, the Franks, who lived in northern and western Europe, emerged as the strongest. A series of Frankish kings gradually amassed more and more territory into one realm. By the 8th century, the one who came to be known as Charlemagne ruled a domain incorporating the lands that now form most of modern France, southwestern Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands. You must see here that Charlemagne was neither French nor German. But the Franks had achieved some measure of unity nearly 300 years earlier, around 500, when Clovis of the Merovingian dynasty defeated rival Frankish chieftains and consolidated his rule over what is now southwestern Germany and France. He also became Roman Catholic, helping to spread Christianity in Europe and gaining support from the Pope in Rome. After Clovis's death and the division of his kingdom among his sons, these Merovingian kings gradually lost control of their holdings, which came to be administered by men called mayors of the palace. One of these mayors, Charles Martel the Hammer, led a Frankish force against the Muslim army that was moving into Europe through Spain. After his victory at Tours in 732, in which he was hailed as the defender of Christendom, the Franks became united politically behind Charles and his family, later known as the Carolingians. In 751, with the backing of the Frankish nobles and the blessing of the Christian Church, Charles's son, Pepin the Short, deposed the reigning Merovingian and became king of the Franks. In return for its blessing, Pepin struck against the church's enemies, forcing the heathen Lombards to withdraw from Rome and granting a strip of land in central Italy to Pope Stephen II. The papacy's power grew in Italy, and it was bound closer to the Franks and distanced from the Byzantine Empire in Constantinople, a division that would deepen over time. In 768, Pepin's son Charles, later called Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, became king of the Franks at the age of 26. A large man, his remains indicate he was about 6 feet 4 inches tall. Charlemagne was as energetic as a warrior as he was a statesman. Charming, friendly, fond of hunting and swimming, he spent most of his time on horseback, traveling constantly to monitor his lands and expand their borders. During his reign, he conquered what is now Germany, France, northern Spain, and most of Italy, forcing defeated people to accept Christianity. Once, when the vanquished failed to convert, he had 4,500 Germans rounded up and beheaded in one day. Sometimes called the father of Europe, Charlemagne brought to his lands a unity not known since the earlier days of the Roman Empire. Although barely literate himself, he respected learnings and encouraged the founding of schools in cathedrals and monasteries. He granted land to nobles who would support him politically and militarily, and created an atmosphere in which craftsmen could work. Although he delegated much of the local administration to his counts, he knew better than to allow them free rein. Instead, he created an order of court officials known as missi dominici, envoys of the Lord ruler who visited the counts and inspected their operations. The origin of the feudal system, in which vassals owe loyalty to local overlords, is often dated to Charlemagne's era. Later in his life, Charlemagne slowed his constant traveling in order to build a grand palace at Aachen in what is now Western Germany. The palace included marble, gold, silver, and brass, and incorporated mosaics taken from old Roman buildings. Charlemagne swam every day in the palace's hot springs, often joined by friends. He founded a school at Aachen that became a center of Carolingian learning. Charlemagne's expanding empire created a great alarm within the West's other great power, the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantines believed that there was room for only one emperor in the former Roman Empire, and that ruler was theirs. Yet they couldn't ignore Charlemagne's strength. His armies occasionally clashed with those of Byzantium over disputed areas of land. A proposed marriage between his daughter and the son of Irene, ruling region of the Byzantine Empire, eventually fell apart. Byzantium's fears were realized in 800. Charlemagne had come to the defense of the Pope against opposing nobles in Rome. In gratitude, the Pope crowned him Holy Roman Emperor in St. Peter's on Christmas Day. Charlemagne accepted the coronation, and the Byzantines recognized his title in 812. Yet the empire he controlled barely outlived him. After Charlemagne died in 814, his empire became a patchwork of kingdoms controlled by rulers who passed the land to heirs. Charles the Great's children and grandchildren lacked his strength and abilities, and what had briefly been a united Europe became again a number of independent kingdoms. Feudalism, 800 to 1000. The twin needs of medieval people for military protection and for food production gave rise in some places to the political system known as feudalism, in which land was parceled out in exchange for services as well as the payment of rent. It was a class system. The status that a person held in society depended in large part on the amount of land he controlled. At the top was the king, who granted land to nobles in exchange for their support. At the bottom were the peasants, who worked the land for masters. Feudalism has appeared in Japan, China, Persia, and Byzantium, but its most systematic, widespread, and long-standing tenure was in Europe, beginning in the 8th century, respectively. Its roots lay in the policies of rulers such as Charlemagne, who sought the support of powerful nobles by granting them large estates. The nobles tried to guard their property in the king's realm by doling out parcels of land to lesser lords, vassals, who served as knights in time of conflict. The lesser lords in return contracted peasants to work their land, growing rich from tolls, taxes, and produce generated from the labor of their serfs. With their wealth, lords could acquire the armor and mounts necessary to serve their king. Wherever capable men are found, Charlemagne ordered, give them woodland to clear, and the forests of Europe were leveled to create the manors of the feudal age. The more manors that could be supported, the more knights were available for military duty, and thus did Charlemagne maintain a powerful fighting force. Two developments enhanced the economic success of this system of mutual dependency. The mold-board plow turned the heavy northern soil efficiently. The horse collar allowed horses faster than oxen to pull plows. Faster cultivation meant more grain production, important to the manor in trading for goods such as salt and metals, which it could not produce. Central to the feudal system were the manor houses of the major nobles located in militarily defensible positions and garrisoned with professional troops for protection. In Charlemagne's time, manors were most likely simple, square towers encircled by wooden walls. As centuries passed, they became imposing castles, stone fortresses with turrets and slitted windows from which archers could shoot attackers, moated bastions accessible only by crossing a drawbridge. Such manors came to dominate the countryside in Western Germany, France, and Low Countries in the early Middle Ages, when large cities were few and the population was scattered. They formed the center of largely self-sufficient communities with their own mills and breweries, forages, and markets. In case of an outside threat, peasants could retreat to the safety of the castle and aid in its defense. Otherwise, they lived in dirt-floored huts and worked from dawn to dusk, seeing to the master's land first, tending their own when time allowed. They plowed his soil, planted his crops, harvested his wheat for bread and beer, butchered hogs, split wood for fuel, and worked on roads and walls. Thus, although feudalism provided an effective military organization and some security for all parties, it thrived on inequality. The aristocratic classes enjoyed wealth and leisure on the backs of serfs. What the peasant produces in a year, the lord wastes in an hour, the serfs lamented. Religion was their comfort, however, but even here they adhered to the feudal system, praying to saints to intercede for them with God, just as they petitioned their lord instead of their king. Most serfs owed heavy debts to their masters and rarely worked their way out of bondage. They were watched over by stewards who made sure that they fulfilled their service obligations. The feudal system became even more firmly established after Charlemagne's death in 814. His empire collapsed, and much of Europe disintegrated into small fiefdoms. New waves of marauding warrior groups, Vikings and Magyars, swept through Europe with no unified force to oppose them. As the invasion threat began to recede in the 11th century, a stable political climate and better agricultural techniques led to the development of larger towns. Markets arose where peasants could sell surpluses to eventually buy their freedom. Some serfs simply slipped away from the manor and became mercenaries or set themselves up as free persons. In the increasingly mobile urban culture of the new millennium, European landowners found it more profitable to hire day laborers to do their work than to maintain a peasant and his extended family. Over the next few centuries, the feudal system began to fade.